the marketplace falls silent. You're standing in the heart of ancient Rome, watching something that will be whispered about for 2,000 years. A young woman with dark hair entering a brothel cell, closing the door behind her. Outside, the city continues its daily rhythm. Inside, an empress is about to compete in a contest so scandalous that historians still debate whether it was real or the most vicious character assassination ever written. 25 men, one night, and a reputation that would outlive the empire itself. Before we dive into what really happened behind those palace walls, I have to say, knowing that people from every corner of the world are curious about this same moment from ancient Rome, it still amazes me every time. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Her name was Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of his children. By day, she attended state dinners with visiting diplomats, her posture perfect, her expression serene. By night, according to multiple ancient sources writing within decades of her death, she wore a blonde wig over her dark hair, left the palace through a servant's entrance, and disappeared into Rome's most notorious red light district. The year is 48 CE, and Rome stands at the absolute peak of its power. 300 years into the empire, the city has perfected the machinery of conquest, administration, and spectacle. The Forum gleams with marble looted from Greece. Ships from Egypt deliver grain to feed 1 million people. And in the shadowed corridors of the imperial palace, a 22-year-old woman is about to make decisions that will seal her fate forever. But to understand how an empress ends up in a brothel cell competing with prostitutes, we have to go back 7 years to when she was just 15. And power was something that happened to her, not something she controlled. The girl who would become Rome's most infamous empress was born into bloodline, so blue it practically glowed. Valeria Messalina descended directly from Augustus's sister, making her Roman aristocracy at its purest. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful in the way Romans valued pale skin, dark hair, features sharp and memorable. But what people noticed most wasn't beauty, it was intensity. When she looked at someone, they felt examined, evaluated, judged. At 15, she's told she's marrying the emperor's uncle. No discussion, no courtship, just an arranged marriage to solve a minor political problem. Claudius is 47 years old. He drags one leg when he walks, he stutters when nervous. Saliva escapes his mouth during speeches. For decades, his own family has treated him like an embarrassment, keeping him away from public events, assuming he's too simple-minded for politics. This assumption has kept him alive through Caligula's paranoid purges. Nobody bothers killing someone they consider harmless. Imagine being 15 and told your wedding night will be with this man, a man 3 decades older, a man whose physical condition you find repellent. Roman law didn't recognize female consent as particularly important. The marriage happened, she had no say. Then, 3 years later, everything changed in a single morning. Caligula is assassinated by his own guards in 41 CE. The palace erupts into chaos. Soldiers search for the next emperor, and they find Claudius hiding behind a curtain, trembling. Almost as a joke, they proclaim him ruler of the known world. Suddenly, impossibly, the man everyone dismissed as an idiot commands the greatest empire in human history. And Valeria Messalina, barely 18 years old, becomes Empress of Rome. Think about what that moment must have felt like. You're 18. Yesterday you were nobody particularly important, married to the family embarrassment. Today you command unlimited wealth, thousands of servants, access to anything Rome can offer. You've already produced 2 children, Britannicus and Octavia, securing your position. Your husband is emperor, but he's also 50 years old, physically unappealing, and, by all accounts, not particularly interested in sex. What do you do with absolute power and complete boredom? According to Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Elder, 3 separate historians writing, when eyewitnesses were still alive, Messalina began slipping out of the palace after dark. She wore a blonde wig to disguise her distinctive dark hair. She dressed in ordinary clothes, and she vanished into Rome's streets with just one trusted attendant. Palace guards noticed, but what could they say? Confronting the empress about her nocturnal activities could easily result in their execution. She went to the Subura, Rome's notorious red light district where prostitutes worked in tiny cells and sailors from across the Mediterranean came seeking pleasure. The sources claim she worked under the name Lysiska, which means chevalf. She paid the brothel owner for the privilege of using a room. She serviced clients who had absolutely no idea they were sleeping with the Empress of Rome. Read that again slowly. This wasn't forced prostitution. She was paying to do it. This wasn't financial desperation. She commanded the wealth of an entire empire. According to the sources, she sometimes charged normal prostitute rates. Other times worked for free. The motivation wasn't money. It was something else entirely. Something the ancient sources couldn't name because Roman medicine had no framework for understanding psychological compulsion. Modern psychology might recognize patterns of hypersexuality disorder, where sexual thoughts become intrusive and compulsive, where behavior escalates despite obvious negative consequences, where normal satisfaction becomes impossible to achieve. But in ancient Rome, they just called it female depravity and moved on. During daylight hours, Messalina played her role perfectly. She attended state functions beside Claudius with appropriate dignity. She received foreign ambassadors. She managed the imperial household efficiently. Nobody watching her at official ceremonies would suspect that hours later she'd be in the Subura, anonymous in her blonde wig, doing things that would shock even Rome's jaded population. But anonymous encounters weren't enough. She began hosting elaborate gatherings at the palace that violated every norm of Roman propriety. What can only be described as orgies, where senators and their wives performed sexual acts in front of each other, often at Messalina's explicit instruction. These weren't entirely voluntary. When the empress invites you to a party, refusing could be interpreted as disrespect, potentially treason. The guest lists read like a directory of Rome's power structure: senators seeking appointments, generals needing commands, merchants wanting lucrative contracts. Once they participated, Messalina owned them. They couldn't oppose her without risking exposure of their own behavior. It was blackmail through hedonism, and it worked remarkably well. Claudius remained somehow oblivious, or perhaps he chose oblivion. It was safer than confronting what his wife was doing, but his freedmen advisors, former slaves who had risen to positions of enormous power, watched carefully. Narcissus and Pallas, the 2 most powerful men after Claudius himself, understood that Messalina threatened the empire's stability. But moving against an empress required perfect timing and unquestionable proof. Then came the competition that would make her legendary. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History just decades after Messalina's death, describes it matter-of-factly. Messalina challenged Rome's most famous prostitute, a woman named Scylla, to see who could satisfy more men in 24 hours. Picture this scene to women: one an empress in disguise, one a professional courtesan, engaging in what might be history's most bizarre contest. According to Pliny and sources that quote him, Both women worked through an entire day and night. The specific numbers vary. Some say 25 men, others claim higher, but the consistent claim is that Messalina I is still seeking more partners when Sila admitted defeat. The sheer physical logistics strain belief. 25 men in 24 hours means a new partner roughly every hour, with no breaks for food, sleep, or recovery. From a medical standpoint, this would cause severe tissue damage and complete exhaustion. Did it really happen exactly this way? Many modern historians are deeply skeptical, but the story appears in multiple independent ancient sources, which suggests that at minimum, Romans believed their empress had done something extraordinarily scandalous involving sexual excess and public competition with prostitutes. The scandal was becoming impossible to hide. Too many people knew. Common Romans gossiped about seeing the empress in the Subura. Senators who attended her parties whispered to each other. Narcissus and Pallas watched, building their case, waiting for the right moment. Then, impossibly, Messalina made everything catastrophically worse. She fell in love with Gaius Silius, by all accounts the most handsome man in Rome, a senator, wealthy, charming, politically ambitious. Their affair wasn't particularly secret, but what happened next defies rational explanation. While Claudius was away at the port of Ostia, overseeing grain shipments, Messalina married Silius in a full public ceremony. She married another man while still married to the emperor. This wasn't a secret tryst. This was a traditional Roman wedding with witnesses, signed contracts, bridal attire, religious rituals, and hundreds of guests. Tacitus describes a celebration complete with music and feasting, held in Messalina's gardens with senators and aristocrats in attendance. What was she thinking? The sources suggest two possibilities. Either she had completely lost touch with reality after years of escalating behavior, or she was attempting a coup, planning to make Silius the new emperor by replacing Claudius. Either explanation requires understanding that Messalina had reached a point where normal risk assessment no longer functioned. Imagine being a guest at that wedding. The invitation arrives, the empress's marriage ceremony, to someone who isn't the emperor. Do you attend? Refusing insults the empress and risks her legendary vindictiveness. Attending makes you a witness to potential treason. Either chose could mean death. Many chose to attend. The celebration continued for hours. Wine flowed. The bride and groom performed traditional rituals. Some sources claim they consummated the marriage publicly, theatrically. This wasn't subtle political maneuvering. This was either madness or an incredibly bold power play. Then word reached Claudius at Ostia. Your wife has married another man in a public ceremony attended by half the Senate. Claudius initially refused to believe it. His advisors had to bring multiple witnesses and show him signed marriage documents before he accepted that this was really happening. Narcissus understood instantly that this was the moment. He essentially staged a counter-coup, taking control of the Praetorian Guard and marching back toward Rome with troops. At the palace, the celebration stopped abruptly. Messengers finally reached Messalina with news. Claudius was returning with the Praetorian Guard, and he knew everything. Reality crashed down. She sobered instantly, understanding with perfect clarity what this meant. Execution for herself, for Silius, for everyone connected to the wedding. In desperation, she tried one final manipulation. Gathering her children, she set out to meet Claudius before he entered Rome, hoping the sight of his wife and children would melt his anger. It was the same emotional manipulation that had worked for years. But Narcissus intercepted her. He warned Claudius that seeing Messalina would destroy his resolve. He physically prevented the meeting. Silius faced execution first. He didn't resist or beg, only requested a swift death. He received it, beheading the same day. Guests from the wedding were hunted down systematically. Some were executed. Others were given the option of suicide, which in Rome meant killing yourself before soldiers did it for you. Messalina withdrew to the gardens of Lucullus, an estate she had stolen years earlier through false accusations. Ironically, it would become her tomb. With her was her mother Lepida, largely absent throughout Messalina's life, but present now at the end. She tried to write a plea to Claudius, but couldn't find words. She considered suicide, but couldn't summon the courage. Fear paralyzed her. Narcissus didn't risk leaving her fate to mercy. He sent a tribune and centurion with strict orders. Kill her immediately. They found Messalina with her mother, a dagger trembling in her hand. The tribune waited, giving her the chance to take her own life and die with dignity. She couldn't, even facing certain death. Courage failed her. Her mother urged her to end it herself, rather than be executed like a common criminal. But Messalina hesitated, frozen between pride and terror. Finally, the tribune lost patience. He stepped forward and struck her down with his sword. Messalina died at 22 years old in the garden she had stolen, killed by the same imperial machinery she had once commanded. Claudius was dining when messengers brought news of her death. According to Suetonius, he showed no emotion, didn't ask how she died, expressed neither grief nor satisfaction. He simply continued eating, then called for more wine, as if nothing particularly significant had occurred. 2,000 years later, historians still debate what actually happened. Every source has clear biases. Tacitus was a moralist who used Messalina as a cautionary tale about female depravity. Juvenal was a satirist whose job was exaggeration, not accuracy. Suetonius loved scandalous gossip, regardless of verification. Pliny was repeating stories he'd heard rather than documenting events he witnessed. The consensus among modern scholars is that Messalina likely did engage in scandalous sexual behavior. The general pattern is probably real because it led directly to her execution. But the specific details, working in a brothel, the 25-man competition, the exact nature of palace orgies, might be exaggerated or invented entirely. Why would sources exaggerate? Because after Messalina's death, Claudius married Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, who had her own agenda for controlling historical narratives. Making Messalina look as terrible as possible made Agrippina look better by comparison. Feminist historians have asked uncomfortable questions about why Messalina's sexual behavior became so legendary. When male emperors did comparable or worse things with less historical condemnation, Caligula allegedly committed incest and rape. Nero would later force senators to watch him assault their wives. Yet Messalina's reputation as sexually depraved exceeds them all. Why? Because female sexual agency terrified Romans more than male sexual violence. A man exercising power through sex was normal, even admirable. A woman actively pursuing sexual pleasure for herself, controlling male bodies, choosing her own partners. This violated every Roman assumption about proper gender roles. Messalina had to be destroyed not just politically, but historically, turned into a cautionary tale that would frighten women away from sexual autonomy for centuries. Her children paid the price for their mother's scandal. Britannicus was eventually poisoned by Nero, Octavia was forced to marry Nero, suffered through a miserable marriage, and was executed after he tired of her both. were forever tainted by association with history's most infamous empress and the men who orchestrated Messalina's downfall. Narcissus and Pallas accumulated vast fortunes and effectively ran the empire for years, their power secured by her removal. So, a 15-year-old girl in an arranged marriage became empress at 18, lived 7 years of scandal, and died at 22. Whether she really serviced 25 men in one night or that detail was propaganda, we'll never know with certainty. What we know is this: her name became synonymous with female sexual excess for 2 millennia. Roman sources created a monster to frighten women into obedience, and the truth is probably more complex, more human, and sadder than the legends suggest. She left no writings of her own, no record of her perspective, her motivations, her own understanding of her behavior. We only have accounts written by her enemies after she was dead and unable to defend herself. In that garden, as the sword fell, did she understand that her story would be told for 2,000 years? That millions of people across centuries would hear her name and think of scandal, never knowing whether she was a victim of her own compulsions, a casualty of Roman misogyny, or simply a young woman who wanted to feel something real in a life that was never truly hers to control. The archives preserve the execution. They record the charges. They list the men who benefited from her death. But they never capture the moment when a 22-year-old woman stood in a garden with a dagger in her trembling hand. Unable to save herself, knowing her story was ending, but having no idea it was just beginning.